My mentor took my manuscript, published it under his name, and told the world I was his assistant. He forgot I had sent the first draft to every person who mattered. 3 months before he claimed he wrote it. My father came to this country with 3 suitcases and a box of books. Not metaphorically, 3 actual suitcases. One for clothes, one for his medical instruments, one for whatever else fit, and a cardboard box sealed with packing tape that he had carried on the plane as hand luggage on his lap for the entire 9-hour flight from Port-au-Prince to JFK because he did not trust the cargo hold with the things that mattered most. There were 31 books in that box. I know because I counted them once, when I was 12, sitting on the floor of our apartment in Crown Heights while he was at the hospital. 31 books, mostly in French, some in Haitian Creole, a few in English that he had been teaching himself from. Médecine interne, Histoire d'Haïti. 3 novels by Jacques Roumet that were so warm they were held together by the kind of careful hope that keeps things intact long past the point where physics would recommend otherwise. He became a doctor here. Not easily. Not in the American way that makes stories neat, where effort produces reward in a clean and satisfying sequence. It took 9 years of recertification and residencies and the specific grinding labor of a man who had already done this work once and was doing it again in a different language with a different accent in hospitals where the nurses sometimes called him by his first name. He did it because he had always done the work. He was a man who believed that the work was the only thing you could actually control, and that controlling the things you could control was the only dignity available in a world that controlled most things for you. I am his son. My name is Marcus Cole. I am 34 years old, and I write. I've written since I was 15. Not well at first, and not well for a long time after that, but consistently, with the stubbornness of someone who has decided that a thing is worth doing and will continue doing it past the point where intelligence would recommend stopping. I grew up in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, in a neighborhood that had changed 3 times in the decade since my parents arrived, and was in the middle of its 4th change when I was writing the book that this story is about. I went to public schools, and then to CUNY on scholarship, and then to a fellowship year at a small literary magazine that did not pay enough to live on, but did pay enough to keep writing. I've been a journalist for 8 years. I say journalist loosely. I mean the specific, unglamorous variety of journalism that exists at magazines that reach audiences of 40,000 and pay their writers enough to cover rent if they are disciplined about everything else. I write long pieces, reported pieces about communities and systems and the specific, granular reality of lives that don't often appear in the publications that pay better. I am good at it. Not famous good, the kind of good that people in the industry respect without the industry being large enough for that respect to produce much of practical consequence. The book was different. I had been working on the book for 4 years when Edward Harlow stole it. 4 years of evenings and weekends, and the subway commute, and the hour before bed, and the occasional Saturday morning when I told myself I would write until noon and wrote until 3. 4 years of drafts that were wrong, and then less wrong, and then, finally, in a version I finished on a Thursday night in September and sent to my sister Dara at 11:47 p.m. because she was always my first reader. Right. The book was about my father. Not a biography, not in the conventional sense. Something harder to categorize, which was part of why I had been unable to find an agent willing to take it on, despite 2 years of trying. It was a book about 3 generations of Haitian immigration in Crown Heights. My grandfather, who had come in the 60s and worked in a factory in Red Hook for 22 years. My father, who had come in the 80s and rebuilt his medical career in a system that was not designed to make that easy. And my own generation, the children of people who had chosen America and been changed by it in ways that were complicated to honor honestly. It was reported, I had interviewed dozens of people, had gone to Haiti twice, had spent months in the archives of the Brooklyn Public Library and the Haitian American community organizations that had been documenting this history since the 70s. And it was personal. My father's voice was in it, his stories, his hands, the 31 books in the cardboard box. It was the most true thing I had ever written. It was also the thing that Edward Harlow read for 4 years while I believed he was helping me make it better, and then took. I want to tell you about the cost of writing something true before I tell you about what he did with it. Because I think the cost matters. I think you need to understand what 4 years of evenings and weekends and subway commutes and 11:47 p.m. emails to your sister actually represents before you can understand what it means when someone else puts their name on it. The cost is not just time, though the time is real. It is the specific cost of having to look directly at the things you love and describe them accurately, which is harder than it sounds. My father is not a simple man. His life was not a simple story. There were years in his early practice here when he was exhausted in a way that I watched as a child and did not have language for until I was an adult, when I understood that the exhaustion was not just physical, but was the exhaustion of a man operating in a system that required him to be excellent without acknowledgement, and patient without reciprocity, and grateful for opportunities that were, in any honest accounting, below what he had earned. To write about that accurately, to write about him as a full person, not a symbol of immigrant virtue, not a cautionary tale, but a specific man with specific gifts and specific wounds, required me to look at things I would have preferred to look away from. I looked. I wrote it down. That is what the book cost. And then Edward Harlow put his name on it. I met Edward Harlow at a workshop in the fall of my 30th year. He was already, by then, the kind of person whose arrival in a room reorganized the attention in it. 61 years old, silver-haired in the distinguished rather than elderly way, with the bearing of a man who had spent 4 decades being listened to, and had come to inhabit that posture so naturally that it no longer read as arrogance. It read as presence. He had written 4 books. The first had won a National Book Award in 1994. The others had been progressively less celebrated, but progressively more influential in the literary world, which is a specific and interesting inversion that happens with certain writers as they age. The books get quieter, and the reputation gets louder. He taught in the MFA program at Columbia. He wrote essays for publications that still mattered. He was, in the world I was trying to enter, a significant name. The workshop was held in a brownstone in the West Village that belonged to a literary foundation whose funding I did not understand, but whose events were well attended by the kind of people I needed to know. I had submitted 15 pages of the book. Not the strongest 15 in retrospect, but the ones I felt were most finished, and had been selected, along with 11 other writers, for a weekend workshop that Harlow was leading. He read my pages on Friday evening. On Saturday morning, in the workshop session, he talked about the other submissions first. Thoughtfully, generously, with the specific quality of criticism that makes the person receiving it feel that they have been genuinely engaged with, rather than efficiently processed. Then he picked up my pages. He looked at me across the room. "This," he said, "is a voice I have not encountered in 20 years." The room did what rooms do when something like that is said. It shifted, slightly, in my direction. Not dramatically, just the small atmospheric change that occurs when a significant person directs significant attention toward a specific object. He talked about my pages for 12 minutes. I know because I timed it later, listening to the recording I had made on my phone. He talked about the specific quality of the prose, the way it moved between the reported and the intimate, the way the family history and the community history breathed together without one suffocating the other. He talked about the voice, Brooklyn without being performative about it, Haitian American without being reductive about it, grief adjacent without being grief consumed. He said things about my writing that I had been trying to articulate to myself for years and had not found the words for. He stayed after the workshop ended. "I'd like to work with you," he said. We were standing near the bookshelf at the back of the room, and he had a glass of wine, and I had a glass of water, and the afternoon light was coming through the window at the angle that makes everything in the West Village look like the establishing shot of a particular kind of New York story. Not in a formal mentorship capacity. I don't take on students outside the program, as a rule. But what you're building is something I'd like to watch being built. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I was 30 years old. I had been trying to get this book right for 2 years, and one of the most respected voices in American letters had just told me I had something worth working on. The calculation was not complicated. What followed were 4 years of weekly meetings, sometimes in his office at Columbia, sometimes in the coffee shop on Amsterdam Avenue he favored for what he called working sessions, sometimes by email in the long exchanges that accumulated between meetings. He read every draft. He commented in the margins with the specific surgical attention of someone who understood prose at the sentence level and could identify in a single line the difference between what was working and what was performing the act of working. His comments were sometimes hard to receive and almost always right. I improved significantly under his guidance. I know that. Whatever he did later, that was real. He helped me make the book better. But he also asked questions. This is the thing I did not understand at the time and understand completely now. The questions were the operation. Not the comments in the margins. Those were legitimate. Those were what a mentor does. The questions were something else. He asked about my grandfather with a specificity that exceeded what a writing workshop required. The factory in Red Hook. Which neighborhood exactly? Which block? What the building looked like? Whether it was still standing? What my grandfather had told my father about the other men he worked with? He asked about my father's recertification, the specific hospital, the names of the attending physicians, the language of the rejection letters from the first 3 programs he applied to. He asked about Crown Heights in the 80s, the specific sounds of the neighborhood, the particular light in the apartment, the way my parents spoke to each other about Haiti when they didn't think I was listening. I told him everything, because that is what you do when a person you trust asks you about the things you love. Because the intimacy of the questions felt like the intimacy of genuine interest. And genuine interest from a person of his standing felt like a form of validation that I had been working toward for 4 years. Because I was 30 years old and I had not yet learned that the most effective exploitation wears the face of mentorship so convincingly that you do not see the difference until you are looking back at it from the other side. I told him everything, and he wrote it down. The email came on a Tuesday morning in February. It was from a friend named Candace, who worked in publicity at a mid-sized literary agency, and who had a habit of sending me industry news that she thought I should know. Release announcements, deal reports, the ongoing gossip of a world that was small enough that its gossip had material consequences. She sent it at 8:42 a.m., with no subject line and no message, just a forwarded Publisher's Weekly announcement. I was on the subway. I read it standing up, holding the pole with one hand and my phone with the other, in the specific, compressed attention of the morning commute. The announcement was for a new book from Farrar and Cross, one of the most prestigious literary publishers in the country, the house that had published 3 of Harlow's previous books. The book was called Borrowed Country: 3 Generations of the Haitian Dream in Brooklyn. The author was Edward Harlow. The publication date was 8 months away. The description, which ran to 4 sentences, read, "A landmark work of literary journalism and personal reckoning, Borrowed Country traces 3 generations of Haitian immigration through the streets of Crown Heights, Brooklyn, from the factory workers of the 1960s to the medical professionals who rebuilt their careers in a system resistant to their talents, to the American-born children who carry both inheritances. Weaving archival research, community voices, and intimate family history, Harlow has produced a book that transforms a specific community's story into a universal meditation on the price and promise of the immigrant dream. I read it once. The subway went into a tunnel. The signal dropped. I stood in the dark of the tunnel between stations with my phone in my hand and the announcement no longer loading and the words still in my eyes. 3 generations of Haitian immigration through the streets of Crown Heights. The factory workers of the 1960s. The medical professionals who rebuilt their careers in a system resistant to their talents. The American-born children who carry both inheritances. These were not similar themes. These were not parallel interests that 2 writers had coincidentally arrived at from different directions. This was my book. My grandfather, my father, my generation. The specific formulation I had arrived at after 2 years of trying different structures and discarding them. The 3-generation architecture, the movement from Crown Heights labor to Crown Heights medicine to Crown Heights memory. The phrase price and promise that I had written in my notebook the night I finally understood what the book was actually about. The signal came back. The announcement reloaded. I read it a second time. Then I opened my email. I went back through the archive. Not the recent archive, the deep archive. The folder labeled Dara/book that I had maintained since the beginning of the project, because Dara was always my first reader, and I kept everything I sent her. I scrolled past the recent drafts, past the mid-project revisions, past the early chapters I had sent her one at a time when I was still figuring out the structure. I found the email from September 14th. Subject: Doc Zumanya, Creole English, our family shorthand, the language of a brother sending his sister something he needed her to see. Attachment: borrowed country _draft1.docx. 247 pages. Timestamp: 11:47 p.m. 2 years and 5 months before the publisher's weekly announcement. The train pulled into my station. I got off. I stood on the platform while the other passengers flowed past me, and I looked at the email on my phone, at the date, at the attachment, at the subject line in our family's particular mixture of languages. And I felt the specific, cold, structural quality of understanding something completely for the first time. Not the emotional version of that understanding. Not yet. That would come later, in waves, when I had time to let it. What arrived first was the factual version, the clear architectural recognition of what had happened and what I had and what it meant. He had taken the book. I had the email. I had the timestamp. I climbed the stairs out of the station and walked to the coffee shop on the corner where I sometimes worked in the mornings, and I ordered coffee, and I sat down at a table by the window, and I opened my laptop, and I began to do what my father had always taught me to do when faced with a situation that required a response. I did not react. I thought. And then, carefully, I began to prepare. I spent the first week not calling anyone. This is a decision I made consciously. On the morning I read the announcement, sitting in the coffee shop with the laptop open and the email from September open, and the 4-sentence Publisher's Weekly description that I had now read 11 times, still sitting in another tab. The instinct, the immediate reactive instinct, was to call someone. Candace, who had sent me the announcement. A lawyer. Harlow himself. The instinct was to move, because movement feels like agency, and agency feels like control. And I had just discovered that someone had exercised significant control over something I had built over 4 years without asking my permission. I did not call anyone. Instead, I went home that evening and I opened my email archive from the beginning. Not just the Dara/book folder, all of it. The correspondence with Harlow, 4 years of it, beginning with the thank you note I had sent after the West Village workshop, and continuing through the hundreds of exchanges that had accumulated since. Workshop notes, draft comments, the questions. I read through all of it. It took me 3 evenings, I read with the attention I bring to reported work, not looking for a story I had already decided to tell, but trying to understand what was actually in the record before I decided what it meant. What I found, reading 4 years of correspondence with the hindsight of the publisher's weekly announcement, was a pattern that I had not been able to see from inside it. The questions I had described, the ones about my grandfather's factory, my father's recertification, the crown heights of my childhood, were not evenly distributed across 4 years. They clustered. They intensified at specific points that, when mapped against the draft timeline, corresponded exactly to the chapters I had been working on. When I was writing the section about my grandfather's arrival in the 60s, Harlow's questions became intensely specific about Red Hook, about the factory's location, about the names of the other Haitian men my grandfather had worked with. When I was writing the section about my father's hospital years, the questions shifted. Which hospital? Which programs had rejected him? What the letters had said. When I was writing the final section about my own generation, about what it meant to be Crown Heights born and Brooklyn formed, an American in a way that was specific and complicated, the questions became the most intimate of all. He had not been asking because he was interested in me. He had been asking because he was building a file. And the pattern went further than the questions. There was a phrase he had used in an email from 2 years ago, a comment on a draft chapter, offered as a note on my language, that appeared, word for word, in the 4-sentence Publisher's Weekly description. Price and promise of the immigrant dream. I'd written those words in a notebook in the 3rd year of the project, had used them in a draft, had shown that draft to Harlow. They were in the announcement, under his name. There was a structural detail, the specific 3-generation architecture, the movement from labor to profession to cultural inheritance, that I had described to Harlow in a working session 2.5 years ago, in the coffee shop on Amsterdam Avenue, sketching it out on a napkin when I finally understood what the book was trying to be. I had told him, it's 3 generations, it has to be 3, and each generation has to transform what the one before it carried. He had said, yes, that's the spine of it. He had said, that's the whole book right there. He had said, that's the whole book right there. Because it was. I closed the laptop on the 3rd evening and sat in the quiet of my apartment in Bed-Stuy. The apartment I had moved to 2 years ago, when Crown Heights had become unaffordable for me, in the specific way it becomes unaffordable for people who have the wrong kind of roots in a neighborhood that is being valued for the wrong reasons. And I thought about the 4 years I had just read. I thought about how it had felt to show those pages to someone who understood them. To hear someone say, this is a voice I have not encountered in 20 years, and believe him. Because why would you not believe a person who says that to you, when the belief is the thing you have been building toward for 4 years of evenings and weekends and 11:47 p.m. emails to your sister? I thought about what it costs to show your work to someone. Not the monetary cost, the other cost. The cost of making something that is true and private and specifically yours, and giving another person access to it. The cost of trusting that the access will be used for the purpose it was offered for. He had used it for a different purpose, and he had done it slowly enough, incrementally enough, question by question and draft by draft, that I had not understood what was happening until I read the announcement of the finished product. That was the part I kept returning to in those first evenings of reading. Not the betrayal itself, the mechanism of it, the patience of it, the specific, sustained, careful patience of a man who had understood what he wanted and had taken 4 years to extract it, slowly, in pieces, through the instrument of a relationship that I had experienced as the most significant professional support of my career. I had not been stolen from in a day. I had been stolen from incrementally, over 4 years. Every meeting, every question, every draft he asked to keep a copy of, to reference, to have on hand. I sat with that. Then I called Dara. I called Harlow on a Thursday. I had spent 2 weeks preparing, reading the record, assembling the timeline, talking to Dara, thinking carefully about what I knew and what I could prove, and what the difference between those two things meant for how I proceeded. I had not yet spoken to a lawyer. I was not yet sure I needed one, or rather, I was not yet sure what a lawyer would tell me that I didn't already know. He answered on the second ring, with the warm, unhurried quality of a man who has enough professional security that phone calls are pleasures rather than obligations. "Marcus," he said. His voice had the specific timbre it always had when he was pleased about something, rounded at the edges, confident without being loud. "I read the announcement," I said. A pause. Not a long one. The pause of someone who had been expecting this call and had prepared for it. "Ah," he said. "I was going to reach out to you about that." "Were you?" I said. "Marcus." His voice shifted. Not to defensiveness, which I might have expected. To something more like patience. The patience of someone who has decided in advance that they are going to explain something and that the explanation will be sufficient. "This is a complex situation, and I want to handle it with care. Can we meet?" "I'd rather talk now," I said. Another pause. Then he spoke, and what he said in the next 4 minutes was the most precisely constructed version of a lie I have ever heard delivered in real time. He had been working on Borrowed Country independently, he said, for several years, a project that had grown from his long interest in immigrant communities and specifically in the Haitian diaspora, which he had been researching and writing about since a trip to Port-au-Prince in 2019. His work with me had been valuable, genuinely valuable, and he had learned from it, as mentors always learn from the people they work with. If there were thematic or structural similarities between his book and my manuscript, that was the natural consequence of working in the same creative space, of two writers thinking through the same material in proximity over an extended period. This happened. It was well documented in literary history. He cited 2 examples. He said this carefully, precisely, with the fluency of someone who had gone over it enough times to have removed all the hesitations. Then he said the thing. "Marcus," he said, and his voice had the specific quality of someone about to deliver a truth they believe the other person needs to hear. "You are a talented writer. I have believed that since the first time I read your work. But we live in the reality of the literary marketplace. My name on a book about this community will reach audiences that your name, at this stage of your career, cannot reach. That is not a judgment of your talent. It is a description of how publishing works." I let the sentence finish. I let the silence that followed it last for 3 seconds. Then I said, "I sent the full manuscript to my sister on September 14th, 2 years ago. The email has a timestamp. The attachment is the complete draft." I paused. "The title is Borrowed Country. The structure is 3 generations. The language in your publisher's weekly description, Price and Promise of the Immigrant Dream, appears verbatim in the draft." Nothing from his end for a moment. "I think we should talk in person," he said. His voice had changed. The rounded warmth had not disappeared, but something beneath it had reconfigured. "I agree," I said. "But I wanted you to know what I have before we do." I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table in my Bed-Stuy apartment in the quiet of a Thursday afternoon in February, and I looked at the window. And I thought about my father's 31 books in the cardboard box. And I thought about the 8-hour flight with the box on his lap, because he did not trust the cargo hold with the things that mattered most. I understood that feeling now, in a way I had not before. I picked up my phone and called a lawyer. The literary world is small. I do not mean this as a complaint. It is simply a fact about the ecology of any professional community that is defined by a shared set of objects and a relatively finite set of institutions that produce, distribute, and evaluate those objects. There are a limited number of significant publishers, a limited number of significant agents, a limited number of publications whose reviews actually move the needle on a book's reception, a limited number of programs that carry enough prestige to affect a writer's trajectory. The people who operate within this ecology know each other. They have history with each other. They owe each other things and are owed things in return. And these debts are the connective tissue of an industry that runs on relationships as much as it runs on books. Harlow had 40 years of that connective tissue. I had 4 years of trying to build some. When I began, carefully, selectively, only with people I believed I could trust, to describe what had happened, the responses I received were not what I had hoped for, and not what I had expected. The first agent I spoke to, a woman named Patricia, who had been reading my work for 2 years, and with whom I had been in what I understood to be a serious conversation about representing the manuscript, took 3 days to respond to my email about the situation. When she responded, she was warm and sympathetic and ultimately non-committal in a way that I recognized as the careful non-commitment of someone who has had a different conversation since the one I thought we were having. "I've heard from a few people about this," she said on the phone. "I want to be fair to both sides." "Both sides of what?" I said. "Marcus," she said, in the tone of someone who is about to say something they believe is true, but that they know the person on the other end will find painful. "Edward is saying that you were his research assistant on the project, that there's been some confusion about the nature of your contribution." "Research assistant. I sent the full manuscript to my sister 2 years ago," I said, "before he ever submitted anything to Farrar." "I hear you," she said. "But Marcus, this is Edward Harlow. He's been in this industry for 40 years. He's not someone people—" She stopped. She was looking for the right word. "This is a difficult situation to navigate." She did not call me again. The pattern repeated. Not everywhere, not universally. There were people who listened carefully and said honestly that they didn't know enough to have a position, which I respected, even when it frustrated me. But there were also people who had heard Harlow's version before they heard mine, and whose version of the truth had been shaped by 40 years of accumulated professional trust that I had not had 40 years to build. I did not have 40 years. I had 4. What I did have was the email. And what I was learning in those February weeks was that the email, the timestamp, the attachment, the subject line in Creole English, was real and provable and significant in a legal sense, and that its legal significance was, for the moment, entirely separate from its social significance. In the social world of literary New York, what mattered was not yet who had the documentation, but who had the reputation. And in that contest, I was not currently winning. I wrote it all down. Not for publication, not for any audience except myself and the lawyer I had finally engaged, a woman named Simone Adeyemi, who worked in intellectual property and had been recommended by a journalism colleague who had used her in a copyright dispute 2 years before. I wrote down every conversation, every non-response, every carefully calibrated expression of sympathy that arrived without any actual support attached. I wrote it down because writing things down was how I thought. Because my father had kept records of everything. Because the record was going to matter, and I knew it. And because the act of describing accurately what was happening was the only form of control available to me in a situation where everything else felt like it was moving against me. I was not panicking. I was not finished. But I will tell you honestly, there were evenings in those weeks when I sat in the Bed-Stuy apartment and thought about the book. about the specific, irretrievable quality of the thing I had built and what it meant that someone else was going to be seen as having built it, and felt a version of what my grandfather must have felt in the Red Hook factory, working at a level that the people around him did not fully see and might not have acknowledged even if they had. I thought about what he had done with that feeling. He had kept working. So did I. Dara Cole has been my first reader since I was 16 years old. Not because I asked her to be, because she read everything I wrote, without being asked, from the first time I left a story on the kitchen table and came home from school to find it annotated in her handwriting. She was 2 years younger than me, and she read faster and more carefully than anyone else I knew, with the specific attention of someone who had decided that books were serious, and that seriousness was the appropriate response to anything serious. She read the way my father kept records, as though the material mattered and the details were evidence. She worked at a nail salon on Nostrand Avenue that she had been at for 7 years, that she part-owned, that she ran with the same practical intelligence she brought to everything. She knew more about American literature than most of the MFA students I had met, because she had read her way through it while doing nails, which meant she had read it without anyone telling her what to think about it, which I have come to believe is the better method. I called her on the Saturday after the Thursday I called Harlow. She answered on the first ring. "I saw the announcement," she said, before I could say anything. I stopped. "When?" "Week before you called me," she said. "Publishers Weekly. I follow the industry stuff now because of you." A pause. "I was waiting to see if you'd see it." "You didn't call me," I said. "I was going to," she said. "I wanted to look at it more carefully first." Another pause. "I pulled out the email, Marcus." "The September email." "Yeah." I heard her moving, the specific ambient sound of her apartment in Crown Heights, the street noise from Nostrand. "I have it, with the attachment, the whole draft." She was quiet for a moment. I also took screenshots of the announcement the night I saw it, because the description was so... I read it and I thought, I know this book. And then I thought, wait. I sat with that. My sister, 2 years younger than me, who read everything I wrote and worked at a nail salon on Nostrand Avenue, had seen the announcement before I did, had recognized it for what it was before I had been told, and had pulled out the email and taken screenshots and waited. She had not panicked. She had prepared. "Dara," I said. "What?" "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "What are you going to do?" I told her what I had done so far. The lawyer, the timeline I was building, the conversations that had not gone well in the literary world. She listened without interrupting, which was her way when something was important. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that I have thought about many times since, because it was the thing that clarified for me what I was actually dealing with. "Marcus," she said, "he didn't just steal your book. He stole Daddy's story. He stole Compere's story. He stole the whole neighborhood's story, and he put his name on it." A pause. "He thought he could do that because he figured nobody who mattered would check. He figured you didn't have the receipts." She paused. "We have the receipts." I did not expect a response. When Simone, my lawyer, advised me to send a formal letter to Farrar and Cross documenting the timeline and requesting a conversation before the book moved further toward publication, I agreed that it was the right step. I did not expect it to produce anything beyond a referral to the publisher's legal department and the beginning of what would likely be a long, expensive, uncertain process that Simone had outlined to me with the careful honesty of someone who respected my situation enough to not make it sound simpler than it was. The letter went out on a Tuesday. On Wednesday morning at 8:47 a.m., I received an email to my personal account. The sender was Nina Park. Her title was listed in her signature: Senior Editor, Farrar and Cross. The email was 4 sentences. "Mr. Cole, I received the letter from your attorney yesterday. I am not writing in my capacity as the editor assigned to Mr. Harlow's book, but as an individual who has been in possession of some information relevant to the situation you have described. I think we should speak before this goes further into legal channels. Are you available this week? I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to Simone with a single line. Is this what I think it is? Her response came 20 minutes later. Call me. Nina Park was 38 years old, Korean-American, and had been at Farrar and Cross for 12 years, working her way from editorial assistant to senior editor in a house that was not known for fast advancement, which meant she had earned every step. She had edited 3 of the previous year's most talked-about books, including a debut novel that had won a PEN Award. She was, in the world of New York publishing, someone whose editorial judgment was taken seriously. She was also, as I would come to understand in the phone call we had that Thursday, someone who had been suspicious from the first month she received Harlow's manuscript. We spoke for 40 minutes. She was careful and specific and entirely honest in a way that I had not expected and that I found, in the context of the weeks I had just come through, almost disorienting, like finding solid ground after a stretch of uncertain terrain. She told me what she had noticed. The voice, first. She had edited enough books to understand that a writer's voice is not something that changes fundamentally between projects. It deepens, develops, refines, but it remains recognizably itself. She had read all 4 of Harlow's previous books, and she knew his voice. Precise, cerebral, with the specific quality of a man who had spent his life in academic and literary environments and whose prose reflected that origin. The prose in Borrowed Country was different. Not slightly different, substantially different. Warmer, more specific about physical and sensory detail, more intimate in its relationship to its subject matter. It was, she said, the voice of someone who had grown up in the story they were telling, rather than someone who had arrived at it through research and report. I thought about it for a month, she said. I told myself it was development, that this was a new direction for him, a more personal project. But the specificity kept bothering me. Writers research deeply, but there's a difference between a detail that has been researched and a detail that has been lived. The book was full of lived details. She paused. So I checked the metadata. She had checked the metadata of the Word document Harlow had submitted. Standard practice for her, she said. She had developed the habit years ago after a plagiarism issue at a previous house had gone undetected because no one had thought to look at the file properties. She checked metadata on every submission she received, not because she suspected wrongdoing in most cases, but because it was a 2-second check that occasionally revealed useful information about a document's history. The document Harlow had submitted had been created by an account named Marcus Cole 22. The creation date was 14 months before the date Harlow had represented to the publisher as the date of his first complete draft. She had not said anything to Harlow. She had not said anything to her colleagues. She had labeled the file, Hold, Verify Authorship, and placed it in a folder on her personal work server and continued with the editorial process while she thought about what to do with what she knew. When your letter came, she said, I had been waiting for it for 4 months. I sat in my apartment in Bed-Stuy on a Thursday afternoon with the phone against my ear and Nina Park's voice describing 4 months of quiet, private certainty. 4 months of knowing something was wrong and holding the evidence carefully and waiting for the person whose name was in the metadata to find their way to the door. Why didn't you do anything sooner? I said. A pause. Not a defensive one, a considered one. Because I needed to understand the situation before I acted, she said. Because acting on a metadata discrepancy without understanding the full picture could have caused damage in the wrong direction. And because... Another pause. Because I wanted to make sure that when this surfaced, it surfaced in a way that could actually be resolved, not just flagged and buried. I thought about that. I thought about my father, who had spent 9 years navigating a system that was not designed for him, doing the work without shortcuts, because shortcuts in medicine cost people their lives, and he had taken an oath about that. I thought about Nina Park, who had checked the metadata because she always checked the metadata, and who had held what she found for 4 months, and done nothing with it, and done nothing with it until the person whose name was on the document found their way to her. "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me yet," she said. It was the second time in 2 weeks I had been told that. We have some work to do. Let me tell you exactly what the email contained. Not because the technical details are the most interesting part of what happened. They are not. The most interesting part is what the email represented, what it meant, and what it took from Harlow the moment it was introduced into the record. But the technical details matter because precision matters, and because this is a story about documentation. And documentation that is not precise is not documentation. The email was sent from my Gmail account on September 14th at 11:47 p.m. Eastern Time. Gmail timestamps are recorded in the sender's local time zone and stored in UTC on Google's servers. The timestamp is embedded in the email's header metadata and cannot be altered without access to Google's server infrastructure. Which is to say, for practical purposes, it cannot be altered. This is not a legal opinion. Simone confirmed it with a technical consultant. It is simply how email timestamps work. The subject line was Documania, Creole English, our family's private register, the language of the kitchen and the phone call, the shorthand of 2 children of a man who had carried 31 books in a cardboard box and raised them to understand that words had weight in any language they arrived in. The recipient was Dara Cole. 1 recipient. No CC, no BCC. The attachment was a single file. Borrowed country _ draft 1.docx. Word document. 247 pages. 89,412 words. Author field in the document properties, Marcus Cole. Title field, Borrowed Country, 3 Generations of the Haitian Dream in Brooklyn. I want to dwell on that subtitle for a moment, because it is important. 3 Generations of the Haitian Dream in Brooklyn. The subtitle on the Farrar and Cross announcement for Harlow's book was 3 Generations of the Haitian Dream in Brooklyn. Not similar, not parallel, identical. 11 words in the same sequence, describing the same architectural structure of the same book, under a different name. Simone presented this in our first formal meeting, with her full legal analysis, with the calm specificity that I had come to understand was her mode when the material was strongest. The identical subtitle is the element that moves this from strong circumstantial evidence into something more definitive, she said. Subtitles are compositional choices. They represent the author's specific formulation of the book's scope and argument. 2 independent authors working on related material from independent sources do not arrive at 11-word identical subtitles. I thought about the napkin on the table at the coffee shop on Amsterdam Avenue. The afternoon I had sketched the structure for Harlow. 3 generations, the transformation of what each one carries. He had said, "That's the spine of it." He had not said, "I'm writing this down for myself." He had not said, "I'm going to use this." He had said, "That's the whole book right there." Because it was. The email existed in 2 places simultaneously, in my Gmail archive and in Dara's. It had existed there since September 14th, 2 years ago, unaltered, in the same state it had been in when I pressed send at 11:47 p.m. after sitting at my kitchen table for an hour, rereading the draft and deciding it was ready for the first eyes that mattered. The timestamp was not something I had created in response to the publisher's weekly announcement. The timestamp was created by Gmail at the moment of sending and had been sitting there, in both inboxes, unobserved but perfectly preserved, for 2 years and 5 months. Harlow had submitted his manuscript to Farrar and Cross 14 months after that email was sent. The subtitle of his book was identical to the subtitle of mine. The file he had submitted, as Nina Park had discovered when she checked the metadata, had been created by an account named Marcus Cole 22, 14 months before Harlow represented it as his own completed draft. The email was not the most dramatic piece of evidence in the record we were assembling, but it was the first. It was the before. And in any dispute about the origins of a creative work, the before is everything. Because the before means that what followed was not coincidence, not parallel development, not the natural convergence of two writers working in the same space. The before means that the thing existed under one person's name before the other person claimed to have written it. The before was September 14th at 11:47 p.m. The before was what Nina Park had done was this. In the second week of October, 10 months before the publisher's weekly announcement, she had received the manuscript from Harlow's agent with the standard accompanying materials, a cover letter, a synopsis, a brief author bio, and a Word document of approximately 90,000 words titled Borrowed Country. She had read the cover letter. She had skimmed the synopsis. She had opened the Word document and read the first 30 pages, which was her standard practice for evaluating whether a submission warranted the time required for a full read. The first 30 pages had been, she told me, immediately striking. The quality of the prose, the specificity of the detail, the intimacy with the material. They had also been immediately dissonant with what she knew of Harlow's previous work. She had edited one of his previous books, not the first, the third, a collection of essays on American identity that had been well received but had sold modestly. She knew his prose. She knew the way he moved through a subject, the academic distance, the careful assembly of argument, the intelligence that was real but that operated from the outside of its material rather than from within it. The prose in Borrowed Country did not operate from the outside. It operated from a position of intimate knowledge that you could not acquire through research, however thorough, however dedicated. It was the prose of someone who had grown up in the story. She had continued reading. She had finished the manuscript in 2 days, which was faster than she typically moved on a submission of that length, because she could not stop. And then she had checked the metadata. She did this, she explained to me, as a routine practice, not because she suspected Harlow specifically, but because she had developed the habit after an incident early in her career, when a manuscript had been submitted by one author that turned out to contain substantial portions of a different author's unpublished work. The incident had not occurred at Farrar and Cross, but it had been well known enough in the industry that she had made a private decision. She would always check the properties of every document she received. It took 4 seconds. It cost nothing. It occasionally revealed nothing of interest. In October, it had revealed something of considerable interest. The document properties of the Word file Harlow's agent had submitted showed the following. Created, November 3rd, the previous year. Author, Marcus Cole, 22. Last modified, September 8th, the current year. Last modified by Edward Harlow, 6-1. She had looked at this for a long moment. Then she had done 2 things. The first, she had made a copy of the file, with the metadata intact, saved to a personal folder on her work server with the label Hold, Verify Authorship. The original, unmodified file, with every property exactly as it had arrived. The second, she had continued the editorial process. She had not told Harlow's agent. She had not told her publisher. She had not told Harlow. She had written her editorial letter, met with Harlow twice, continued the development of the manuscript, and done all of this while holding, in a folder labeled Hold, Verify Authorship, the evidence that the manuscript had been created by someone whose name was not on the cover. I asked her in our Thursday call why she had continued, why she had not confronted the situation immediately. Her answer was considered and specific. Because I didn't have the full picture, she said. The metadata told me the document had been created by someone with the username MarcusCole22 and modified by Harlow. It didn't tell me the context. There are legitimate scenarios where a document has a different author in the properties than the person submitting it. Editorial collaborations, ghostwriting arrangements, co-authorship situations where one person did the primary drafting. I needed to understand which scenario I was in before I acted. She paused. And I needed the other person, whoever MarcusCole22 was, to surface. Because if there was a situation here that needed to be corrected, the correction had to come from the right place. It couldn't just be me making an accusation based on a file property. So you waited, I said. I waited, she said. I knew that if there was someone on the other end of that username with a legitimate claim, they would eventually find out about the book. It was going to be announced publicly. Announced publicly means the person would see it. If they had a claim, they would come forward. And when they came forward, I would have what they needed. I thought about that, about the specific patience of it, the 4 months of continuing to work on a manuscript she believed she understood, while holding in a server folder the evidence that would matter when the right person knocked. You took a risk, I said. I took a calculated one, she said. The book wasn't going to press for another 8 months. I had time. A pause. And I had a responsibility. If I was wrong, if there was a legitimate arrangement I didn't understand, I didn't want to damage anyone's reputation on the basis of a file property. If I was right, I wanted to make sure that when it was addressed properly. She had been right. And when I came forward, she had been ready. The metadata file she had preserved, the original unmodified Word document with the creation date and the author name exactly as they had arrived, was, as Simone confirmed, the most significant piece of evidence in the case. More significant even than the email, because it was evidence that had been preserved by a third party with no stake in my claim, through a practice of professional diligence that she applied uniformly to every manuscript she received. It was not evidence I had created. It was not evidence Dara had created. It was evidence that had been created by Harlow himself, by the act of not knowing or not caring that the documents he had stolen retained, in their file properties, the name of the person he had stolen them from. MarcusCole22. He had not deleted it. He had not known to delete it. Or he had assumed no one would look. Or he had assumed that even if someone looked, it would not matter. He had assumed a great many things about the people who would be in the room with the evidence when it finally surfaced. He had assumed wrong about every one of them. Yolanda Barnes had known Edward Harlow for 22 years. They had met at a conference in 1999, a literary symposium at Yale, at which both of them had presented papers, and had maintained a collegial relationship since then, the kind of professional friendship that accumulates in academic and literary circles over decades. Mutual blurbing, occasional correspondence, the shared attendance of significant events, the kind of regard that two people in the same field develop for each other when they respect each other's work, even when they disagree about its conclusions. She was a professor at NYU's Department of English and American Literature, a scholar of 20th century American immigrant writing, with a particular focus on Caribbean and Haitian American voices. She had published 4 books of literary criticism. She was 61 years old, had been teaching for 35 years, and had, in the assessment of everyone I spoke to who knew her, a reputation for saying precisely what she thought, with the specific calm of someone who had earned the right to do so and intended to use it. Harlow had sent her an advance copy of Borrowed Country in January, with a note asking if she would consider providing a blurb. She had read it. She had not provided a blurb. I found her through a chain of connections that ran through a former student of hers who was now a journalist, and who knew someone who had mentioned my situation in the right room. It was the kind of connection that only works in a world small enough for coincidence to function as infrastructure, which is to say, the world I was operating in. I sent her an email explaining, briefly and without drama, who I was and what had happened. I asked if she had read Borrowed Country. She responded within 3 hours. Mr. Cole, I have been waiting for this email since January. Please call me at your convenience. We spoke for an hour. She told me what she had noticed when she read the book. She was precise and specific in the way of a scholar who has spent 35 years teaching people how to read carefully. And what she described was the literary equivalent of what Nina Park had noticed in the metadata. A fundamental inconsistency between the author of record and the voice in the pages. I know Edward's work, she said. I have read all 4 of his books. I have read his essays going back to the early 90s. I know his prose the way I know the prose of any writer I have studied. Not because I have memorized it, but because I have spent enough time with it to have developed an intuitive sense of how it moves, the speed of the sentences, the ratio of abstraction to concreteness, the way he positions himself in relation to his subject. She paused. The book you have described as yours is not written in Edward's prose. It is written in a prose that is younger, more intimate, more embedded in its material. It is written by someone who was inside the world they are describing, not looking at it from a respectful, critical distance. I asked her when she had decided not to write the blurb. On page 47, she said, there is a passage about a factory in Red Hook, the quality of the light in winter, the specific sound of the machinery, the way the men talk to each other on breaks. It is a beautiful passage. It is also a passage that no researcher writes. That passage was written by someone who was told about that factory by someone who was there. A pause. Edward Harlow has never been to Red Hook. He grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut, and has lived in Riverside Drive for 30 years. That passage was written by someone whose grandfather worked in that factory. My grandfather had worked in that factory. I had described it to Harlow in a working session in the 2nd year of the project. He had taken notes on his laptop. I had watched him type. What did you do when you decided not to write the blurb? I said. I sent Edward a note saying that I was overcommitted and would have to decline, she said. And then I waited. I did not know what I was waiting for. I knew only that the situation required more information than I had, and that the most likely source of that information was someone I had not yet heard from. A pause. And then you emailed me. She was prepared to make a formal statement, a written declaration, submitted as supporting documentation, describing her professional assessment of the voice in the manuscript and its inconsistency with Harlow's established prose. She was a professor at NYU with 35 years of expertise in exactly this area of literary scholarship. Her assessment of authorial voice, of the specific identifiable qualities that constitute a writer's signature, was not an opinion. It was professional analysis. I want to be clear about something, she said before we ended the call. What I have described to you is what I observed in the text. I have no personal animus toward Edward. I have respected his work. But the work in that book is not his work, and I have spent my career teaching people to read carefully enough to know the difference. A pause. He should not have done this, and the person whose name belongs on the cover should have their name there. I thanked her. You don't need to thank me, she said. This is what the work requires. I have thought, many times, about what Harlow believed when he submitted that manuscript. Not what he told himself. I am less interested in the internal narrative of a man justifying something unjustifiable, because those narratives are always the same. The rationalizations are always approximately proportional to the magnitude of the act, and the more significant the act, the more elaborate the construction that is required to live with it. I have no doubt that Harlow had a construction. I have no doubt that it was, to him, coherent. I am interested in what he believed about the world outside his own narrative, what he thought would happen, what he calculated the risk to be, and why he calculated it as acceptable. I think the calculation was this. He believed that the gap between his name and mine was wide enough to make the truth irrelevant. Not that there was no truth. He knew there was a truth, obviously. He had been in possession of the manuscript for 4 years. He knew who had written it. The truth was not in question for him. What was in question was the truth's practical consequence, and his assessment of that consequence was based on a set of assumptions about the world that I think he had held for so long that they had become invisible to him, had stopped being assumptions, and had become simply the way things were. The first assumption, that Marcus Cole, at 34, without an agent or a publishing history or a name that appeared in the literary press, did not have the resources or the standing to effectively contest a claim by Edward Harlow, at 61, with 40 years of reputation and 4 published books and a position at Columbia, and every institutional connection that 4 decades of literary success accumulates. This assumption was partially correct. I did not have those resources. What I had was Simone Adeyemi, who was excellent, and a Gmail archive, and a sister who had checked her email before I knew to check mine. The second assumption, that the people around him, the agents, the editors, the colleagues who would receive the book, blurb it, review it, celebrate it, would process it as his work because his name was on the cover, because his name had always produced that processing, because the name had accumulated enough trust over 40 years that people would not look closely enough at the thing behind it. This assumption was also partially correct. Most people would not look closely. Nina Park had. The third assumption, that the people in Marcus Cole's life, a sister in Crown Heights, a network of journalist friends, whatever connections a 34-year-old writer without significant publishing history could access, were not, in any meaningful sense, a threat to the execution of what he was doing. This was the assumption that failed entirely. He had not accounted for Dara, who had the email and the screenshots and the instinct to pull them out the moment she saw the announcement. He had not accounted for Nina, who checked metadata on every manuscript she received as a professional habit, and who had been sitting on the evidence for 4 months, waiting for the right person to knock. He had not accounted for Barnes, who had known him for 22 years, and had read his work carefully enough to know, on page 47, that this was not it. He had not accounted for any of them. Because he had done what people of significant institutional power often do when they believe they are operating in a space that does not have adequate oversight. He had assessed the people around him by their visible credentials and found them insufficient. Dara did nails on Nostrand Avenue. She had no visible credentials. She had read every book I had ever written, and she had kept an email from September 14th with a 247-page attachment, and she had checked her archive the day she saw the announcement because something felt familiar, which is a different kind of credential than the ones you put on a CV, but is not, in the end, less valuable. Nina was a 38-year-old editor who was not a partner, who did not have the institutional weight that came with 30 years in the industry, who was young enough that Harlow had presumably calculated she would process the manuscript as her job required and not look further. She checked metadata on everything. She had for years. She had done it quietly, without telling anyone, because it was simply what careful people do. Barnes had known Harlow for 22 years and had received his work with the collegial goodwill of a long professional relationship. He had presumably calculated that goodwill as a form of loyalty that would not be tested. She declined to blurb a book she believed was not his, and then she waited, and then she answered my email within 3 hours. He had built his calculation on the assumption that the people who mattered were the people with the most visible institutional power. He had not built it to account for the people who paid attention. That was his error, the only one that mattered. The careful ones were everywhere. He had simply never looked. The formal negotiation took 6 weeks. I want to describe what those 6 weeks felt like before I tell you what was in them, because I think the feeling matters, and because I think people who have not been through something like this imagine it as either more dramatic or less exhausting than it actually is. It was not dramatic. It was the specific, grinding exhaustion of a process that moves in the language of legal correspondence and publishing contracts and carefully worded statements, that requires your full attention and produces almost nothing visible, that consists mostly of waiting for responses that take longer than they should, and reviewing documents that say what you expected them to say, and generating counter documents that say what you need them to say, and sending everything to Simone, who reads it and tells you what it means and what to do next. It was the most tired I had been since the 4th year of writing the book, when I had been working 2 jobs and writing on the weekends, and beginning to wonder, quietly, whether the thing I was building had any future beyond my own kitchen table. I was not afraid of the outcome. That is the honest thing to say about those 6 weeks. I was exhausted, but not afraid. I had the email. I had the metadata. I had Barnes's statement and Nina's documentation and Dara's screenshots and Simone's clear, unequivocal assessment that the evidentiary record was, by any reasonable standard, definitive. The question was not whether the record was real. The question was what Farrar and Cross would do with it. What Farrar and Cross did, to their credit, was the right thing. I want to say that clearly because I think credit should be given where it exists. The publisher's legal team, once they had reviewed the full record, the email timestamp, the metadata, Barnes's literary assessment, the side-by-side comparison of the subtitle, did not dispute the evidence. They did not attempt to minimize it or to construct an alternative account that accommodated it. They moved, within 3 weeks of receiving Simone's formal presentation, to a conversation about resolution. Harlow's agent had a different approach. He spent 2 weeks presenting the argument that the evidence was circumstantial, that the similarities were explainable as the product of a prolonged mentorship relationship, that the metadata discrepancy was a technical artifact of shared document editing, rather than evidence of original authorship. Simone addressed each argument with the patience of someone who has prepared for the arguments she expects to receive, and finds that receiving them is confirming rather than concerning. She had prepared for all of these. She had the responses ready. The negotiation arrived at a point in the 5th week where 3 possible outcomes were on the table. The first, co-authorship credit, Harlow and Cole, with a revised acknowledgement explaining the nature of their collaboration. This was Harlow's preference. His agent presented it twice. Simone said no both times, on my explicit instruction. Not because co-authorship credit was nothing. It was something. It would have been real recognition. It would have been my name on the cover of a Farrar and Cross book. But because co-authorship credit for a book I had written alone, with a man who had taken it without asking, was not accuracy. It was a negotiated version of the truth, and I had not spent 4 years writing the truth in order to publish a negotiated version of it. The second, full authorship credit to Marcus Cole, with an acknowledgement page thanking Edward Harlow for editorial guidance and mentorship. The publisher's preference. It was the option that protected them most cleanly, that resolved the legal exposure, that allowed the book to proceed to publication with the minimum of institutional disruption. The third, Marcus Cole as sole author. No acknowledgement to Harlow, with a full editorial restart. New introduction, new positioning, new jacket copy. Simone's recommendation. My preference. We got the second. I accepted it. Not because it was everything I wanted, because it was accurate. Because the acknowledgement of editorial guidance was not false. Harlow had contributed something to the development of the book, had made it better in some ways, had sharpened my thinking about the material even as he was extracting that material for his own use. Acknowledging that, without crediting him with authorship he had not earned, was the accurate version of the history. I do not want to suggest that accepting accuracy is the same as feeling satisfied. There is a gap between those things, and I want to be honest about the gap. The outcome I got was the right outcome, and it was not what I had originally imagined for this book, which was publication on its own terms, in the context I had built around it, without the shadow of someone else's name in the acknowledgments of my own work. That original imagining was gone, replaced by something that was true, but was also, in certain lights, the residue of something that had been broken. I accepted that. I accepted it because the alternative, continuing to fight for the uncontaminated version of a story that had already been contaminated, was a form of refusing the actual situation in favor of a theoretical one. And I had not built this book by refusing actual situations. The book was scheduled for publication 9 months from the date the agreement was signed. My name on the cover. 3 generations of the Haitian dream in Brooklyn. I did not say anything publicly about Edward Harlow. I want to be precise about this because I think the precision matters. I made a deliberate decision not to speak publicly about what had happened, not to write about it, not to give interviews where it would come up, not to position my own narrative about the book in opposition to his. I had the record, the email, the metadata, Barnes's statement, the resolution, and I chose to let the record exist where it existed, in the legal and publishing process, rather than carry it into the public space where it would inevitably become something other than what it was. This was not passive. It was a choice I made for specific reasons. The first reason was the book itself. Borrowed Country was a book about my family, my community, 3 generations of people who had come to this country and built lives in Crown Heights, and whose story deserved to be received on its own terms. If I went public with the Harlow situation before the book was published, the book would be received primarily as the book at the center of a dispute, as an exhibit in a story about literary misconduct, rather than as the thing it actually was. I did not want that. The book was not an exhibit. It was a book. The second reason was Dara, and my father, and the community the book was about. I had not written it to produce a scandal. I had written it to produce a true account of something that mattered. The true account deserved to be the primary event, not the context for something else. The third reason was simpler. I was tired. I had spent 4 years writing the book and 6 months fighting for it, and I had nothing left for a public campaign. I wanted to finish the revisions, hand it to Nina, and let it go out into the world. What happened in the literary world happened without me. Nina Park told the right people. She was careful about it. She did not broadcast, did not post, did not write a public account. She spoke, selectively, to colleagues she trusted, about a situation she had observed at close range and found worth describing. In the world I was describing earlier, the small, connected, relationship-operated world of New York publishing, the right people told the right other people, and the right other people told a few more. And within 6 months, the shape of what Harlow had done was understood well enough in that world that its consequences became real. Barnes did not stay silent after my book was published. She wrote a piece, not about Harlow specifically, not naming the situation directly, but about the structural conditions of literary mentorship and the particular vulnerability of writers from communities that have been historically underrepresented in publishing, who come to mentor relationships needing more and therefore risking more. It was a measured, carefully argued essay in a publication that was read by exactly the people who needed to read it. People understood what it was about. She had written it that way on purpose. The Columbia investigation, the internal review that eventually resulted in Harlow leaving his position, was not initiated by anything I did. It was initiated by former students who had been waiting, for years, for the moment when the institutional weight that protected Harlow had shifted enough to make coming forward survivable. My situation had shifted it. Not because of anything I said publicly, but because the resolution of my situation had made it visible, within the relevant community, that Harlow's conduct was a pattern rather than an incident. The students came forward. The institution, once it could no longer claim ignorance of a pattern, had to act. I was not involved in the investigation. I was not a witness. I submitted nothing. He lost his position in March of the following year. I found out from Candace, the same friend who had forwarded me the Publisher's Weekly announcement 11 months earlier, who sent me a 2-word text on a Tuesday morning. It's done. I read the text. I put the phone down. I went back to the revision I was working on. The book was due to Nina in 6 weeks. The book came out on a Thursday in October. I was in Crown Heights that morning. Not for any particular reason, or rather, for the reason that I had been in Crown Heights most Thursday mornings for 4 years while writing this book, because the neighborhood had a quality in the mornings that I needed access to in order to write it accurately. The specific light on Nostrand Avenue before the street was fully awake. The sound of the bakery opening on Sterling Place. The quality of air that has a particular density in October in Brooklyn, something between summer and whatever comes after it. I walked past Dara's salon. She was already there. Through the window, I could see her setting up for the day. The chairs, the stations, the ordinary preparation of a person opening a business in a neighborhood that had changed around them while they stayed and continued to work. She saw me through the window. She held up her phone, the book's cover on the screen, the one Nina had designed with the specific Brooklyn gray and gold palette that I had approved in July. She raised her eyebrows. I raised mine back. She went back to work. I walked to the park on Eastern Parkway, and I sat on a bench and I held my copy of the book. I had been given an advance copy 2 weeks earlier, and I had read it then, or rather, I had held it and opened it to the first page and read the dedication, which was 2 lines. For Dr. Jean-Pierre Cole, who carried 31 books on a 9-hour flight. And for Dara, who always reads first. I had read those 2 lines and put the book down, because those 2 lines were as much as I could hold at once. I had read the rest over the following week. It was the book I had written, the book I had worked on for 4 years, the book that was about my grandfather's factory and my father's recertification and Crown Heights and the specific, complicated, unreduced truth of 3 generations of people who had come here and paid the price and received the promise and found that both were larger than they had expected. The book that had been taken from me and returned to me, imperfectly, with marks on it from its transit through someone else's hands, but returned, mine, under my name. I want to tell you what I know, now that the book is in the world. I know that trust in professional relationships is not the same as naivety, and that what Harlow did was not something I should have seen coming or should have protected myself against in advance. I trusted him because the trust made sense, because he had given me reason to trust him, because he had said true things about my work, because the mentorship had produced real learning. The betrayal does not retroactively invalidate the trust. It just means the trust was used in a way it was not offered. I know that what he took was not the book. I want to say this clearly, because I think it is the truest thing I know about what happened. He could not take the book from me. He could take the pages, the specific arrangement of words that I had arrived at after 4 years of revision, and he did. But the book was not just the pages. The book was the understanding I had built through the act of writing them, the knowledge of what my grandfather's experience had been, the clarity about my father that I had developed through the years of writing about him, the specific, irreversible comprehension of what it meant to carry something across a border, what you lost, what you kept, what became of it in the hands of the next generation. He had the pages. I had the understanding. The understanding was not transferable. It is what you find when you read the published version, that the pages came from the inside of the story rather than from its outside. Barnes found it on page 47. Nina found it on the first 30 pages. Whatever Harlow had done with the language, he could not make the language come from inside him, because inside him was the wrong place. The language came from inside me, from inside my family's specific history, and that origin was not something a name change could remove. He had borrowed the country. He had never lived there. I know that the people who saved me were not the people with the most institutional power. Dara saved me with a Gmail archive and the habit of reading carefully, and the instinct, on the day she saw the announcement, to recognize something familiar and pull the receipt. Nina saved me with a 4-second metadata check that she ran on every manuscript and had been running for years, and that cost her nothing except the professional habit of paying attention. Barnes saved me with 22 years of knowing one writer's prose well enough to recognize, on page 47, that this was not it. None of them were powerful in the way that Harlow was powerful. All of them were careful in a way that Harlow had never had to be. Because careful is what you become when you operate in a world that does not automatically assume you belong in it. Careful is what my father had been for 35 years. Careful is what I had been for 8 years of writing journalism that reached 40,000 people and paid rent if you were disciplined about everything else. Careful is what saved the book. I know one more thing, and it is the thing I want to end with. Harlow told me that his name would sell books, that mine, at that point in my career, would not. He was correct about this. He was describing, accurately, a feature of the marketplace at a specific moment. I do not dispute the accuracy of the description. What he did not understand, what I think he had spent so long inside the advantages of his name that he had ceased to be able to see, was what the book was actually for. The book was not for the marketplace. It was not for the reviews, or the awards, or the sales figures, or the name recognition that a significant publisher and a significant author's endorsement might generate. Those things were real, and I wanted them, and I do not pretend otherwise. But they were not the reason the book existed. The book existed because my grandfather had spent 22 years in a factory in Red Hook and had never had his story told accurately in a form that would last. Because my father had spent 9 years rebuilding a career in a system that resisted him and had never had that resistance described precisely enough that someone who had not experienced it could understand it from the inside. Because Crown Heights was full of people whose lives were extraordinary in ways that were not recognized as extraordinary by the institutions that decided what was worth preserving. The book existed to preserve them. Harlow's name would have sold it to audiences who might not otherwise have found it. That was real. But it would also have taken it from its community, would have made it, in the record, the work of a 61-year-old man from Greenwich, Connecticut. A story about a community that he had researched rather than lived. The book needed to come from inside the story. It needed to come from the person who had been told about the factory in Red Hook by a father who had been told about it by a grandfather who had worked there. It needed to carry the right name. Not because the name would sell it, not at first, not easily, but because the name was the book's truth. And the truth was what it was made of. And a book made of truth needs its true name in order to be what it is. Borrowed Country is in the world now, under my name. My father read it in March, 2 months before publication, when I gave him the advance copy. He sat in the kitchen of the Crown Heights apartment, not the Nanaimo Street apartment. He had moved here 20 years ago, closer to the hospital. And he read it in 2 evenings, which was fast for him. He is a careful reader, my father. He does not rush. When he finished, he called me. "You got the light right," he said. "In the factory. You got the quality of the light in winter." He had described it to me 4 years ago, sitting at the same kitchen table when I was writing that section, and had called him to ask what he remembered his father telling him. He had described the light in Red Hook in winter, the specific gray quality of it, the way it came through the high factory windows at a low angle and made the machinery look, for an hour each morning, briefly beautiful. I had written it down. I had put it in the book. "I know," I said. "Grand-père described it." "He did," my father said. "I didn't think you'd be able to use it. It's such a small thing." "The small things are the whole book," I said. He was quiet for a moment on the other end. Then he said, "Your grandfather would have been—" He stopped. He is not a man who finishes sentences like that one. He carries things the way the men in our family carry things, silently, with the specific dignity of people who have understood that the world does not always provide an audience for the full weight of what they feel. I know, I said. He said, "Good." We stayed on the phone for a moment without saying anything else. And that was enough. That was, in the end, what the book was for.